A military column of 3,000 men vanished into the desert and never came back. Only 40 years later, archaeologists uncovered their remains, fused into the sand alongside thousands of mummified rats. One diary survived. Inside it was a description of how the rats marched like an army and how they fed on men who were still alive. In late January of 1799, the 9th Regiment of the French Republic left Cairo. 200 horses, 8 cannons, and nearly 3,000 soldiers and officers, hardened by the battles of Toulon and Arcole. At their head rode Brigadier General Etienne Barrade, a man with a face carved from stone and a stomach made of iron. The column moved strictly northwest, cutting through the lowlands of Wadi El Natron. Their mission was simple on paper: deal with Bedouin raiders who were disrupting supply routes between the delta and the desert outposts. The terrain was familiar, the enemy poorly armed. The regiment carried 10 days of provisions and expected to return in 5. They marched out at dawn. The sand beneath their boots was still cold, and the wind carried damp air from the Nile. Cavalry led the way, then artillery, then wagons and infantry. Engineers at the rear recorded the route with careful precision. The French were confident, too confident. By midday on the second day, the regiment disappeared into the dunes and slipped beyond the horizon. From that moment on, they had no witnesses left but the sand. The first thing the search parties noticed later was the silence. In the desert, silence comes in different forms. There is the morning kind, clean and light, when you can hear the wind smoothing the tops of the dunes. There is the night kind, sharp and predatory. And then there was the silence that hung over the place where the 9th had gone. It was thick, airless, dead. Caravans that traveled that route began to drift off course, zigzagging for no reason, sometimes turning back entirely. Guides lost their bearings. Compasses spun and stuttered like broken clocks. 3 times, expeditions tried to follow the regiment's path. 3 times, they returned with nothing. One captain wrote later, in a shaking hand, "This isn't just a place. It's a wound in the earth, and it refuses to heal." A week after the regiment vanished, headquarters sent out reconnaissance. 2 weeks later, they stopped expecting news. A month later, the 9th Regiment was officially declared lost. The explanation was convenient: a sandstorm, an ambush, desertion. Any reason except the real one. French maps from that period marked the region as impassable, stamped with a warning about fever and sickness. No one spoke about the 9th. It was buried the way failed orders are buried, quietly, completely, as if it had never existed. Not until 1838. That year, Egyptian laborers were tearing into the ground to prepare a military outpost when something strange surfaced just over a meter beneath the sand. First came a fragment of a uniform button, then the charred remains of a wagon, then human bones, dozens of them, then hundreds. The skeletons lay in rows, as if arranged, not thrown into a mass grave, not scattered in panic. They rested like men who had simply fallen asleep mid-march. Nearby lay personal effects: canteens, knives, buttons stamped with a lily. And in some of the bones, something else was lodged. Teeth. Small, curved, made for gnawing. At first, the archaeologists assumed it was decay, nature doing what it always does. But the rats were there too, preserved like the soldiers, dried and hardened by the desert air. There were so many it didn't make sense. They lay around the bodies, on top of them, inside them, in eye sockets, between ribs, in empty holsters, everywhere. And every rat's face was turned the same way. North. The direction the 9th had been marching. Later that same year, when a French Orientalist expedition led by Dumanier arrived in Wadi El Natron searching for Coptic ruins, they found something that belonged in neither archaeological reports nor Bedouin memory. Low hills rose from the flat, sand like frozen waves. Workers cleared the first mound expecting another embalmed corpse, another ruined brick tomb. Instead, they found a boot. French, leather, with a brass buckle barely touched by time. Below it was another boot, then a human bone, white, smooth, polished by years of sand like it had been handled by countless hands. And the deeper they dug, the more unnatural the scene became. Beneath the sand was formation. Not a heap of bodies like plague or panic. A formation. Soldiers lay as if placed in ranks, faces turned upward, arms straight at their sides. Their eyes were gone, but their empty sockets faced the sun. Some bodies were so well preserved it looked like they had fallen asleep the night before. Uniforms of the 9th Regiment. Buttons stamped with an eagle. Crossbelts. Even half-rotted satchels still in place. But the flesh carried marks that didn't belong to time alone. Thin scratches, as if thousands of tiny claws had tried to reach the bone. And in places, those claws had succeeded. The first real horror came when a shovel dragged up a dense knot of bodies from the sand. Not human bodies. Rats. Mummified, dried by desert wind, they had kept their shape. Charred black, limbs splayed wide, as if they had crawled until their last breath. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. They lay in layers, mixed with the dead soldiers as if they had built trenches of their own around the regiment. Some still had fibers of cloth caught between their teeth. Others held fragments of muscle. Some seemed to have died trying to force themselves beneath helmets, between ribs, into the narrow spaces where a man's life hides. And then, by accident, one archaeologist flipped over a burned rat corpse. From its hollowed body spilled tiny bones. Not rat bones. Finger joints. Nail phalanges. Gnawed so clean it was hard to tell what they had once been. Medical experts brought in from Alexandria performed a quick analysis and confirmed the impossible. The bones belonged to adult humans. Some were the wrong size to match the rest of the remains. Smaller. Detached. As if taken separately. The experts argued over what it meant. Some suggested, in low voices they didn't want to hear themselves say out loud, that some of the soldiers may have been eaten alive, piece by piece, a finger at a time, over the course of a single night. The smell in the camp was wrong. Not rot. Not decay. Something dry and bitter, like dust scorched in the sun. The sand, soaked with death, seemed to remember, not so much the blood, but the fear. One of the workers, an Arab man named Mahmoud, scooped up another layer and hit a pile of bones tangled with tails. He dropped his shovel and ran into the desert. They never found him. The others kept working in silence, as if afraid of waking something that might still be moving beneath the sand. By the end of the third day of digging, one engineer wrote in his journal, "We have no explanation, but we have formation. A soldier's formation. And above it, rat formation. Two armies, one beneath the other." When the French decided to stop the excavation, it was already too late. A storm hit the camp that night. By morning, part of the tents were buried. Rat paws jutted out of the sand. No bodies, just paws, like sentries left at their posts. Or trophies. When the archaeologists reopened the remains of the battered site, the first thing they noticed again was the smell. Not decomposition, that had vanished long ago. This was different. Thin, dry, almost imperceptible. The scent of singed fur and metal, like burned wiring. In the center of a heap of rotted packs, time-cracked canteens, and faded ammunition belts, they found a diary. Leather cover, edges scorched. The inside was bone-dry, sealed as if by heat. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was neat, tightening into the final lines as if the writer's hand had begun to shake. It belonged to Sergeant Jacques Legrand, a veteran of the Italian campaign, 32 years old. His last entry was written on the third page. It began with a sentence that felt like a confession. "We don't laugh anymore." The first day of the march was described plainly: heat, dust, broken rhythm. But by evening the strange details started to creep in. Legrand wrote that rats began to trail them. At first one or two, then dozens. They didn't run from the men. They watched. He underlined that word. Watched, as if they understood. He took it as a bad omen, but the others joked. One artilleryman called them new recruits. According to the diary, the laughter didn't last long. On the second night, Legrand wrote about waking to a sound he couldn't name at first. Countless tiny footsteps on sand, like rain made of claws. The rats moved in columns, stretched into ranks like infantry on the march. He wrote, "I got up, stepped out of the tent, and saw them moving. 2 lines. Straight through the camp. Not a single one broke formation. They walked between us, through us. They didn't touch the soldiers. Not yet." Panic spread through the tents. One recruit screamed that he'd seen rats drag off a dead mule. Others tried to build a fire, but the sand was damp, like someone had poured water over it. After that, the entries became jagged. The handwriting trembled. Today the rats took Charton. He fell asleep beside the wagon. We found him in the morning. Only his face was left. Like they kept it so we would recognize him. No signs of a struggle. He never even woke up. After that, Legrand began writing several times a day. He said the rats no longer hid. They sat along the perimeter of the camp, watching, breathing in rhythm. One soldier fired at them all night, but by morning his cartridges were gone. The rats ate him while he was reloading. I tried to sleep beneath the wagon. I dug myself into the sand. But they found me. They always find me. I'm not running anymore. I understand now, these aren't animals. This is an army. Precise. Silent. Organized. We are their drills. Their meat. To them, we're what the Turks once were to us. He ended the final entry with a line that sounded like a warning and a curse at the same time. If you're reading this, they spared you. Or you weren't interesting to them. Then you're lucky. Or worse, you're next. After that sentence, there was only a blot, as if the pen had been torn from his hand. There were no more entries. But on the back of the cover, scratched in by a fingernail, was one last message. They know our report. They copy us. They learn. Step. Turn. Attack. We train them. The sand beneath their boots was dead, but something moved inside it. At first it was subtle, like a light breath under a layer of ash. But with each night, that breathing became a rhythm. Tap. Rustle. Scrape. Living motion, as if the desert itself was waking up and forming into columns. Legrand wrote that by the third day the soldiers stopped sleeping. They couldn't. Not because of the heat. Not because of insects. Because of the sound. It was everywhere. In the wagon of provisions. Under their boots. Inside their cooking pots. Behind the walls of their tents. The rats moved like an army. This wasn't a swarm. It was ranks. Tight. Straight. Marching in step. The first time they tried fire, it worked. A soldier threw a burning rag into the shifting darkness, and the rats recoiled. But within an hour they were back. They didn't scatter. They didn't rush. They advanced like besiegers. They split into 3 streams and circled the flames from both sides, as if they understood flanking tactics. Legrand wrote, "We're surrounded. Only instead of cannons, there's sand. Instead of sabers, teeth." A sentry had his tendon gnawed through while he stood on watch. He didn't scream. He simply collapsed. A second later, he was gone. Only a faint whirl of gray bodies remained, like liquid being pulled into the earth. Every attempt to run failed. 2 stragglers were found 3 kilometers from camp. What they found weren't bodies. They were frames, gnawed clean. Bones polished like they'd been washed in acid. One of them was discovered with a cartridge casing clenched between his teeth. It looked like he'd tried to end his own life. He didn't make it. Or he had no bullets left. Or the rats were faster. Lieutenant Mercier tried to gather a squad and break back toward the Nile. His shouts were heard for another hour. Then only footsteps. Then nothing. The men began to lose their minds. Not from fear, but from helplessness. Legrand wrote that an artilleryman named Guillaume drew his pistol and found the magazine empty. Then he found spare cartridges, every single one gnawed through. Cleanly. Precisely. As if someone had taken them out, inspected them, and put them back. Later, Guillaume was found without a tongue. Some said he tore it out himself, so he wouldn't scream. Others said the rats did it in the night. He lasted 3 days, making no sound at all, until he drowned in his own blood. The worst story involved the supply crate. It was locked from the inside. The soldiers wouldn't open it until they caught the smell. Sour blood, rotting flesh. When they finally broke it open, there was one man inside. Or what was left of him. A skull with its teeth still intact. Ankles strapped to the lid by belts looped through the hinges. And 9 dead rats arranged around him. Some had their paws torn off. Others had their eyes crushed. Their bodies lay in a perfect circle, like a ritual, like an offering. No one could tell whether he had eaten them to survive, or whether they had tried to survive on him. But something about the arrangement, its symmetry, its silence, felt foreign. Unnatural. As if they had all died together. Every night the desert looked like teeth. The finest paw prints webbed across the sand like cracks in glass. They vanished with the first light, but each step felt like an echo of something ancient. Something was commanding those creatures. Not instinct. Not hunger. Something cold. Something deliberate. The thick rustling that drifted from behind the dunes sharpened if you listened closely. It wasn't random. It had rhythm. It had discipline. It sounded like an army marching. No one went out on reconnaissance anymore. The men who remained built barricades out of bodies, out of sacks, out of bones. At some point the soldiers stopped telling day from night. The desert had no sun, only a pale glow seeping up from the sand, as if the ground itself had begun to shine. Legrand described one non-commissioned officer who started giving orders to the rats. He lined them up, screamed at them when they fell behind, wept when they scattered. 2 days later, they found him dead, his body arranged into the shape of Napoleon's letter N, rat tracks circling it. Like a signature. Like an oath. By the 5th night, the camp was already half empty. The ones who hadn't died were silent. The ones who stayed silent trembled. One soldier carved a cross into his chest and walked to the edge of camp, staring into the darkness. No one ever saw him again. But the sand remembered. Tiny tracks, thousands of them, in a perfect circle around the prints of his boots, as if something had stood at attention. The echo of teeth never faded. It only drew closer. The general was found lying on his back, as if he had chosen the position himself. In a desert where everything is swallowed quickly by sand, his body had kept in a way that felt wrong. His face was nearly untouched, his skin pale but not gnawed down like the others. Only his eyes were gone, empty holes blackened beneath the shadow of his officer's helmet. His arms were crossed over his chest. In his right hand he still held a uniform button, scraped into a crude metal plate as if by a nail or a blade. A few words were carved into it, rusting under the sun. We are no longer men. We are food. But even food can look at its executioners. The sentence felt too precise, too aware, for a man dying alone. That was the horror of it, the clarity. He knew they would eat him. And he waited. Around his body lay a circle of dead rats, like a dark seal pressed into the sand. Not a heap, not chaos. A clean line, as if they had died guarding him. Each corpse had its mouth torn open, tiny paws stretched forward like soldiers frozen mid-march. No one could explain why they were arranged that way. One archaeologist couldn't take it. He quit on the spot and fled back to Europe, saying he had witnessed a parade of the dead. Later they found him in Paris, obsessively sketching spirals made of paws. No one laughed. Because inside the tent where that plate had supposedly been carved, there were no signs of struggle. No bloodstains. No shredded cloth. Only paw prints. Rat prints. Thousands of them. Perfectly parallel, as if left by a drilled formation. By then, the camp itself was dead. Sand covered most of the bodies, but beneath it were preserved fragments, belts, splintered rifles, severed fingers, everything tangled together with mummified rats. In places it was impossible to tell where the human ended and the animal began. The bones were mixed as if the rats had eaten more than flesh, as if they had eaten memory, chewing through images, names, the structure of a man. One soldier was found hugging his musket, and in his mouth lay a rat. Not bones, not remains, whole, as if it were sleeping. From the position of his jaw, it looked like he died trying to swallow it. General Barrade was the last figure in that mute tragedy. His place in the center of the camp felt like a symbol. The commander hadn't run, hadn't hidden, hadn't died in panic. He lay down and waited. No other bodies were found within 5 meters of him, as if they had left him, or as if he had been needed. Too important to devour immediately. Perhaps he was the last one, and the rats surrounded him like guards. Or like a court. One Egyptian worker muttered. They listened to him. He was their general. Everyone laughed. That same evening, the worker dropped his shovel and never returned. Examination of the metal plate confirmed the carving was done by hand, by the same person who wore the uniform. The style matched military markings from Napoleon's era. Nothing else remained. No letters, no reports, not a single official document from the 9th Regiment. Only that piece of metal. And flesh fused into sand. To the north, in a half-collapsed tent, they found a box of papers. Almost all of it had been eaten away, but between 2 covers lay a medallion. Inside was an eye. Not a glass piece. Not a replica. A real human eye, dried hard. Later genetic testing confirmed it belonged to the same man as the general's body. He had torn it out himself, perhaps as a final gesture, perhaps an attempt to go blind to what was coming. Or to who was coming. To this day, there has been no trace of a Bedouin attack. No signs of battle. No evidence of destruction. The camp still held every rifle, every cannon, even intact horse tack. And yet there were no survivors. No witnesses. Only rats. Their bodies were the main evidence of the disappearance, and every one of them lay around the general as if under orders, like an honor guard. Or a tribute. A year after the excavation, the archaeologists buried the site again beneath sand. Too many eyes were watching. Too many ears were listening. The scientists kept silent, but the workers began to talk about sounds at night, about mutilated bodies of small animals found near the dig, sparrows, lizards, even jackals. Their insides were drained as if through a needle. Rumors spread to Cairo, then to Paris. The French military archives closed access to the 9th Regiment's file. The official explanation became disorientation, heat, dehydration. But one Egyptian engineer who had helped seal the site could never forget what he saw on the final day: movement under the sand. As if the desert was breathing. In early spring of 1912, the British sent an expedition to the area. The stated reason was archaeological supervision during the construction of a telegraph line. Officially. In reality, they wanted the truth about the vanished regiment and the mummified rats. There were 8 of them: Lieutenant Arthur Blake, for colonial soldiers, an Egyptologist, a radio operator, and a photographer. They moved quietly, without fanfare. They didn't want locals to know where they were going. But the Bedouin guide they hired at the valley entrance refused to go any farther after the first night. He said, "The sand whispers at night. That isn't the wind." Then he walked away on foot without taking his payment. On the 3rd day they reached the spot where, by coordinates, the 9th camp had once stood. But the sand carried a dampness that didn't belong out there. Not moisture, rot. It felt impossible. Dozens of kilometers from any water, heat, dry rock, and the smell rising from the ground was like an open grave. One soldier saw the tracks. Tiny, sharp, hundreds, then thousands. All moving in one direction, southeast. They didn't scatter. They didn't cross. They ran straight, organized, as if left by a marching army. The tracks were fresh. The sand still held the shape of paw pressure, as if something had passed an hour earlier. There were no dead rats. Only footsteps. The Egyptologists called it a phenomenon, maybe natural, maybe a trick by locals. The photographer was grim and silent. He simply recorded everything he saw. On the 6th day they made camp. That night, something tried to enter Blake's tent. It wasn't a man. You could hear the difference. The sound was fast, multiple, a dry scraping. Blake fired into the darkness. In the morning the sand in front of the tent was pocked with tiny dents. No blood. No bodies. Only empty impressions, as if an invisible shape had flinched away at the last second. On the 8th day, the first soldier vanished. His name was Howes, and he had been carrying a box of tools. He stepped away to relieve himself and never returned. They found tracks, not human ones, but those same rat prints leading into a narrow fissure. There were no signs of a struggle. Only empty sand. And one boot. A day later, the 2nd man disappeared. Then the 3rd. The photographer began shooting everything, even his own hands. On one photograph, developed in the field, there was a shape in the corner. Blurred, but unmistakably formed. Something standing far off. Low to the ground. With a long tail and a strap across its chest. The photographer tore up the print and refused to speak. After 12 days, only 2 remained, Lieutenant Blake and the radio operator. They decided to leave. That same night. No gear. No food. Just escape. But at dawn, Blake woke up alone. The operator was gone. And again there were no signs of a struggle. Only millions of tiny prints, now everywhere. A circle closing around his tent like a siege line. Blake ran. 50 kilometers through sand with no water. His face and hands burned raw. Local men found him at the edge of an oasis near Wadi El Faran. He didn't speak for 2 days. Then he finally did, and only one sentence came out. They marched, drums in front, something bigger in the center, and behind them, carrying remains. They didn't need us. They were collecting. Blake's report reached the British Ministry of Defense. They declared him insane. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Sussex, where he died in 1918 from blood poisoning after trying to bite through his own arm. On the wall of his room were scratches, neat, horizontal marks. Account: 1, 2, 3. 1688. And below it, carved with a fingernail: "We are not the first. We are not the last. We are only food. And food can march too."